Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bloomberg's Michael Smith and our esteemed panel.
Good morning. Welcome to our panel on sustainability. It's a big word, a big topic, and we're going to try to bring some sense and reality to the word and the topic if we can. And I just want to start by saying, this is an especially tough time to implement major changes in economic, social, and political behavior in just about anywhere in the world, and including the United States, and especially in a region that's been hammered by social, political, economic challenges this year and for a long time. This year, especially in the last year or so, we've seen sky-high inflation, unemployment, and wars engulfing large parts of the world that has affected everybody. And to top it all off, we have elections coming up in a number of important countries, including the United States. So all this adds up to challenges for what I think we all want, which is a world that is more sustainable, that will help us head off and address grave challenges that we now face to the environment and to our daily lives. And specifically in Latin America, I think there are special challenges. And I wanted to start off the conversation with everybody at this table, and I'm not going to introduce everybody. I'm just going to say, for the sake of time, that we have some of the renowned experts and political players, people in finance, in just about all the areas you need to get together to really make advances in the issues of sustainability. So why don't we start on the far right? If you can just give me a very concise answer, everybody, as concise as possible, as to why now? Why should we be thinking about the issue of sustainability, such a big issue in Latin America?
Well, I think that the situation of the planet is so bad because of climate change that you just can't consider all the other factors of economy or the social factors without considering the environmental issues. So at this stage, there's no country that is not affected by climate change. And the efforts we must do in the other fields, like preserving biodiversity and having a healthy planet, is a main objective of all the regions of the world, including, of course, Latin America, that has probably the highest concentration of biodiversity of the planet.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I should preface this by, if you could briefly introduce yourself before you speak, just so people know who's here.
Oh, sorry, I'm Roque, Sevilla. I come from Ecuador. I'm the former mayor of Quito, and I have been engaged in environmental issues all my life.
Okay, next.
My name is Eduardo Verano. I am the governor of Atlántico in Barranquilla, is the capital. Well, the climate change, I would like to speak it very in Spanish. A mí me tocó ir como ministro del Medio Ambiente
As the Minister of Environment of Colombia,
Kyoto.
I had to go to Kyoto.
Cuando regresamos de Kyoto,
When we came back from that place,
no entendía el
people
mensaje
did
que
not
nosotros
understand the
quisimos
message
construir desde
that we
Kyoto.
wanted to convey
Era
since
precisamente dar
Kyoto.
un campanazo de
That is,
alerta,
to
año
give just an
96,
alert that was
97,
1996,
un campanazo de alerta
1997, an
de los
alert
procesos
of all the
que habían,
processes
venido ocurriendo en
that
materia del
have been
cambio
happening
climático
in
y
climate
cómo
change
estos afectarían
and
el
how
planeta.
this will affect the
Y
planet.
realmente la gente
And
no,
so the people
consideraba que eso era
did
tan
not
importante
consider
que
that they
nosotros
were so
estábamos
important
exagerando.
and thought that we were
Pero realmente
exaggerating.
desde ahí se empezó a
But
avisar
from
que
there, From that time, we started to talk about the avoidance of the gradual climate change in the planet at least 1 degree, because we will have extreme changes. That is what we are living now. Extreme changes when drought becomes serious droughts and flooding becomes serious flooding, or what we are living with 2 times of difference in Bogota, Colombia. The dams, Bogota dams, reach minimum level, and we're just very close to a drought rationing. But yesterday we had a horrible rain, and also that was not on the place what it should have been cause. So these 2 extremes are being lived in the same city, that city suffering of a great drought, and they are now becoming cities with floods that they were unable to manage. So these 2 examples are the most important characteristics that we will have with climate change. So if we don't act from the CO2 emissions on to avoid the CO2 emissions that is damaging the ozone, and so more sun is coming through the planet. So we are going to have severe changes that we are going to suffer. And so as politicians, we need to act, convince and educate the people, so that we will have a conviction process that allow us to act against CO2 emissions. Zero CO2 emission, that's the objective, but it's not easy, but that's the objective.
Mr. Ballard?
Right. No, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here, both at this conference and on this panel. So, Chris Ballard, former Minister of Environment and Climate Change in the province of Ontario in Canada, former Minister of Housing in that province, with a focus on our poverty reduction strategy in the province of Ontario. So today leading Passive House Canada, which is a decarbonizing building standard that's known internationally, recognized by IPCC as the best and fastest way to decarbonize buildings. Sustainability, obviously near and dear to my heart for all of the reasons my esteemed panelists have outlined. But if I can make one point that's maybe a bit of a digression, sustainability really is just the beginning. It's not the end goal. And so if Latin American countries can take one thing away from my experience, is that regenerative design, natural design is really the end goal. It's where the world of design is going, of urban planning is going. Sustainability is just a waypoint along that way. So if we think that sustainability is it, it's not. When we get there, when all buildings are 0+ energy creators, that's great, but it's only one step along the way. The next step will be that regenerative design that our cities desperately need.
Okay, Sharon?
Good almost afternoon. I'm Sharon Tomkins. I am the Vice President of Sustainability and Social Impact for TC Energy. And I'll start with sustainability is good practice, it's good business. We want to create long-term sustainable value, both for our shareholders as well as for the communities that we serve. I think Latin America is unique. Our footprint crosses Canada, the US, and Mexico. And one of the things as we're moving to a lower carbon energy system is we need to keep a couple of things in mind. One, energy is a way towards prosperity. And in the developing world and Latin America, there are millions of people that don't have reliable, secure, and affordable energy. I think in Latin America, it's probably about 20 million people don't have reliable electricity. And many are cooking with wood or other fuel sources. And so as we're thinking about a just transition, we need to think about a just transition in a way that not only lowers carbon in the developed world, but creates energy access for all of those in the world, so that they have what we take for granted, which is that when we turn on the lights, we have energy.
Okay. Dana?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Barsky with Standard Chartered Bank, based in Singapore. I lead our sustainability strategy practice globally. I think some of my colleagues here have touched on climate impacts and carbon markets. So I think I just want to touch on the importance of nature and the urgency to protect nature. We cannot afford to waste any time. And why does that matter specifically to Latin America is that the region is quite vulnerable given economic dependence on natural resources and mining and forestry in particular. And then just to touch on one other thing is social inequality in the region. And look, I think as years go on, it just becomes more and more of a problem. And I think we all in this room need to act with a real sense of urgency. I'll just say one more thing, which is our firm did a study of 10 countries in the developing world in Asia. And I think the math would be somewhat similar in this region. And what they found is over the next decade, if we were all to invest 30, I'm gonna get the exact numbers, 30 billion, that would lead to a savings of 376 billion of damages and lost economic impact. And so when we talk about resilience and adaptation, climate adaptation, we really need to think about the multiplier effect, which is over 10 times, and the importance to act now to help us in the future.
Great.
Great. Good afternoon. My name's Hanne. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships at Concordia. Adding to what esteemed colleagues on this session have said, if you've heard the baby blowing raspberries here, she's mine, and so that's my why. That's the urgency, right? I've got a 6-month-old who I would very much like to have a working earth left to. At Concordia, we're seeing a lot of interesting convergence of trends as it pertains to Latin America. And it's not unique to Latin America, but of course for today's discussion, certainly want to focus on 3 just briefly. The role of cities and the leadership at the city level is very exciting. The role of small and medium enterprises, especially in emerging markets, as a front line in climate change. And then the role of creative financing. So all of this is sort of swimming. We're doing creative things in each of those places, and it's an exciting time as you look at each of those pieces. What are SMEs doing? What are cities doing? What is the role of financing? And if we look at that collectively with this challenge of the climate crisis, I think that there's a there, and so that is another urgency element. We have all this momentum in each of those. How do we harness it?
Great. Carlos?
Well, thank you, Michael. My name is Carlos Correa. I'm former Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development from Colombia, and actually I'm a senior fellow at Conservation International. Well, all my colleagues have been talking about climate, about nature, about energy. I think, Michael, you just started talking about political changes in Latin America and America. I think we are having a lot of political changes. This year we will have elections in Panama, Dominican Republic, the United States, and that affects the strategic planning from the region. I think that Latin America is having a great moment, 2024 and 2025, for climate and nature. Why? I mean, it's the first time and maybe the last time we will have this. We have G20 in Brazil in October, November. We will have CBD, COP16 in Colombia, in Cali, in October. We will have COP30 next year in Brazil. So the biggest and most important events about climate, about economics, about nature will be in Latin America 2024 and 2025. So the reflection that I wanted to do is, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to be the king of the Amazon? Who wants to be the king of the Amazon? Is Colombia, is Brazil, is Ecuador, is Peru? No, we have to be together, united, to take advantage of these opportunities. About climate, about nature, and about people. So we have to be, as Latin Americans, all together, Latin American and the Caribbean, working together to get, what we need from here on. Next year, Michael, we will have the update of the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions. Every 5 years, we have to update our commitments as countries. So next year in Brazil, all the countries, 196 countries, should update their commitments. And I think that that's a huge responsibility. We have to take advantage of that, leverage that thing. So working in commitments, finance, as you just said, how are we going to do it? It's not about pledges only. It's about finance, about action, about how are we going to do it. And definitely we need to include government and other stakeholders like private sector are so important. And you talk about mayors. You talk about mayors too. Cities will be very important for these commitments. So
that's an interesting point. I just realized I didn't introduce myself and why I'm sitting here. I'm a senior reporter with Bloomberg News, which means I've been doing it for a long time. I'm based in Miami now, but I spent most of my career in Latin America covering these issues without really realizing that's what I was covering, because I focused a lot on environmental issues, conflicts over water, conflicts over energy, and all these things that have now come to be important elements of sustainability. And since I moved to Miami 6 years ago, I really discovered that Latin America isn't the only place with problems confronting sustainability. Here in Miami, we face it every day. You can smell raw sewage on the street on the way into my office because there's not enough, the sewage system can't handle the capacity, just like I used to smell in Rio when I lived there. Water is a huge issue in Florida and all these other things. And there's varying degrees of political ownership of this as a problem, especially at the state level. And depending on who you want for president of the United States, you're going to find very differing solutions. So I think one thing that I've learned is that the United States needs to lead the way, and that's not always a sure thing. So it's very encouraging to hear that we have people at the local level, like Carlos said, who are really doing innovative things. I wanted to, before I get to your what you want to say, I'm really interested in the political side of this, and I wanted to talk to the governor down near the end about how you can find the political capital, the political will, the political bandwidth to address these problems in a place like Colombia. Which you've been doing, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bueno, realmente, si uno va a esperar tener todo el capital político necesario para poder actuar, uno tendrá siempre pretextos para dilatar en el tiempo acción que es la que finalmente se requiere. A mí me tocó, por ejemplo, una gravísima inundación. El río Magdalena llegó un momento en que creció 3 veces lo normal.
Increased its level 3 times the normal level. It broke everything, damaged everything. I had 25,000 families underwater for 6 months.
En ese momento,
at that time, you cannot cry on the basis of the fact that you don't have the political will, you don't have the resources. You have to act. And ultimately, I think that politics is action. Well, there are peaceful times, calm times, when you can think. That's the time when you think, you get prepared, you get ready. so that at the point you have something like a disaster of this nature, you have all the elements to manage it. In our case, that's what happened. When we had the flooding, we had to face it, and you did not have time to start organizing what you needed to organize. But the reality is that in Colombia there are several activities that have been prepared of civil society actions, civil defense, and the military that are well prepared. The civil society organizations. That's what we managed to organize and work with to meet or face this very serious social situation that we were going through. People didn't know where to live, where to sleep. The Minister of Education called me and said, do not dare take these people to the schools, because then we cannot recover the schools. So where else can I take them? The only space we had to place these people that were underwater at the point were precisely along on these roads, the schools, the soccer fields. We had to do something. That's what led to an immediate political action. So your question, what is the political action required and how do you prepare for this? Well, you have to be previously prepared. And that is where you need that political will, that responsibility on the part of the state, of the administration. And that must be done constantly, because when you're faced with the problem, you don't have time to think. Our case was very, very serious. I repeat, horrible flooding. One-third of our department was totally flooded. 8 towns underwater, more than 120,000 people, 25,000 families. And this really required a coordinated, unorganized state by the state, action by the state. But politically, you have to have a preparation, which has to be done when the times are calmed, to think, to prepare, so that when the difficult times come, you don't have to take time to think, but rather act upon what you have organized before.
A question about what you've been doing, and specifically, can you give us some examples of how it's possible to advance in sustainability and resilience in a region that is short on resources? Can you give me an example of some things that you've actually been able to accomplish?
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's a good question. I see here a lot of friends. I've been talking about this a long time with Gustavo Manrique, former minister from Ecuador too. And the environmental sector always is I don't know in English, like the bad, the ugly.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah. And in Colombia, we only had 0.4% of all the national budget for the environment. And if you talk to Ecuador or maybe in Peru or Latin America, but also if you go to Spain or if you go to another country, you will see that. So there's not only we don't have the necessary funds for climate, but the sector is very poor. But now it's the most important sector in the world because it's transversal to all. We are talking about housing, about energy, transportation, everything, and sustainability is, transversal to that. So we have to be creative. And now we have new forms to finance climate and nature. We have to think about blended finance. We need philanthropic funds. We need private funds. We need government funds. We need carbon markets in Latin America are so important. We didn't have that before, maybe Kyoto or Paris Agreement. But now we have to develop and strengthen our markets in carbon markets, And now we will have COP16 in Colombia, and we need to be faster in the biodiversity credits. For the years ahead. So, Michael, I think that we have to be creative, we have to work together, and we have to do things not only thinking about our country, but also about binational and transnational projects, as we did before with Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, and Colombia with this Pacific, Eastern Pacific corridor on the ocean. We protected, all the ocean on the Pacific, the four of us, 4 countries working together and getting funds, not thinking about who was the president or who was the minister.
Wow,
we did
impressive.
it together. And now this year, Michael, Dominican Republic just announced a new reserve on the Caribbean that we started in the government with President Duque. 2 countries working binationally and looking for funds for that. So we have to be creative. And of course, the private sector has a huge responsibility on this.
So that's a beautiful segue into my next question, which is to the banker in the room. Dana, how, a lot of these solutions are quite expensive, and these are countries that have a long history of getting heavily in debt, doing things that the countries to the north expected them to do. How can we specifically finance these kinds of initiatives using private capital? And when does it make business sense for a bank like yours to do that?
Great. And first to say, Conservation International does some great work. So I'm not surprised that Carlos stole some of my thunder on blended finance. Look, private institutions are economic beasts. So we need to figure out a way to make financing work. One of the many tools in our arsenal is blended finance. Now, blended finance means when a public sector, be it a multinational, an MDB or a development finance institution, provides some sort of risk protection, be it through a guarantee or through some concessional financing, or a philanthropic organization such as Bloomberg would come in with some sort of concessionary capital. There are ways to structure transactions to de-risk them so that the risk reward to a private sector institution such as ours makes sense. Just to touch on some of the, I think, specific innovative financing transactions that have occurred, I'm a big fan of some of the debt for nature swaps that a few of us on this panel have worked on. It is a way to both alleviate the debt burden of certain countries while at the same time freeing up capital to tackle some of the urgent issues such as ocean protection. Now, debt for nature swaps are only a viable instrument when someone comes in and offers a guarantee to strengthen the credit worthiness of such a transaction, again, tackling the risk reward. There are other ways to do that through other types of insurance programs, through concessionary capital, through slicing up the capital structure such that we could have different pieces of risk reward from some subordinate equity all the way through to senior debt. And that allows different players to come in and invest in the instrument that is correct for them.
Okay, well, that's a great segue to what Roque is all about. But before that, I see that Hanne has something to say.
Yeah,
quickly,
thanks.
hopefully.
I wanted to briefly just touch on something also that Sharon mentioned in her introduction, and this is around the idea of reaching different demographics. And I think I've seen a challenge with financing in the Latin American space that it's pretty centralized in more urban or larger markets. So Mexico has some schemes, Brazil has some schemes, but it's harder in just the smaller towns, the municipalities, in structuring for some of those sized projects. And to me, I worry that that's creating this gap of sustainability financing that's leaving people behind. And energy is very much one of those places when we're thinking about energy access for all. Are we leaving people behind in this transition into a green space? So I just kind of want to put that out there for anyone to integrate into their comments as well, or address on. But I think it's an important thread that, especially at Concordia, I was glad to hear Sharon mention it, but I want to weave that in. And I do know we do not have anybody from the Caribbean on this particular session at this moment, but it's only 4% of financing goes into Latin America when it comes to sustainability financing, and even a smaller fraction of that is into the Caribbean countries. So it's how are we building it as a block?
Before we get to Sharon about energy, I wanted to hear Roque's experience with in the Galapagos as a very concrete example, and how you pulled that off in a country like Ecuador.
Thank you, Michael. Well, actually, I had the privilege of developing the very first debt for nature swap back in 1987. That was a very small one of $10 million.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you explain what debt for nature swap actually is?
I'll try to explain.
I don't know if everybody understands.
Basically, it only works with countries that have a discount on the debt. So if the debt, the bonds have a price that is lower than the nominal price, then you can do a debt for nature swap. When we did the very first one, Ecuador was in a very difficult situation, and it had an 87% discount. So we bought the debt in the stock market, $10 million with $1.3 million, and we could buy it back. And what we did is we exchanged those $10 million into $10 million in local currency in Ecuador, and all that money went to the national parks, both interest plus capital. So that is a debt swap. Now we did the largest one in history. And here's Gustavo Manrique, who was our Minister of the Environment, and he did this wonderful operation. And it was a $1.6 billion debt swap for protecting the marine area of the Galapagos, but also for developing a new national park on the ocean area that would join Costa Rica with the Galapagos, specifically the Cocos Islands with the Galapagos Islands. And then we had this agreement among all these countries, as you just mentioned. So this is a way we can finance big operations of conservation, but it only happens if the country has a discount on the debt. So that is one system. The other system, as you just mentioned, is of course the carbon storage system. And in the case of Ecuador, 51% of the surface of Ecuador is still with natural ecosystems that we can use now for doing this exchange. And that means if we sell at $10 the ton, we're talking about $1.2 billion each year. So it's really a very important factor. And if you add to that what is now becoming an important factor, and it is how much biodiversity do you preserve by preserving the forests, then you add up additional prices in the exchange of, in the selling of the carbon, that you say, we absorb carbon, but we also protect the environment and the biodiversity. And this combination makes it very, very attractive. So there is a huge possibility of transferring funds from the north to the tropical areas doing this kind of operations.
Yeah, very inspiring. Sharon, getting back to energy, which we've touched on, everybody sort of knows that we need to transition to clean energy because carbon is at the root of so many of the issues that are facing us when it comes to climate. How can Latin America really afford this transition? Because it's not cheap.
Well, I think,
Or is it?
well, it's interesting because I think there is no perfect energy form of generation. It's a mix of energy sources that create what I like to think of as that North Star. So it's a creation of energy resources that maximizes energy output for reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And that's really what we talk about in the energy is the energy trilemma. How do you create that energy system that gives you that economic prosperity that you need in order to really create viable economies? And I think one of the things that is really important is to have that public-private partnership that I've heard talked about to make sure that as we're investing our resources from a business perspective, that we're doing it in a way that really works with the governments in the various different areas. And an example would be the work that we're doing with CFE in Mexico to create energy access in the southern part of Mexico where there isn't that energy reliability that we take for granted.
I'm sorry, that's natural gas?
We are building natural gas pipelines. And natural gas is one of those carbon sources of energy that really is a backbone to a lot of the renewables because you need to have that reliability. And I think if you looked at the United States, for example, we saw a lot of our carbon emissions decrease in the United States as a result of a switch from coal to natural gas. So natural gas, how do we use natural gas in a way to facilitate that North Star that I talked about? And that's really what we're looking at as you think about other energy sources. So it's a complete suite of resources, and each country has their own right mix. But if we don't get the right mix, we're not going to do what I talked about at the beginning, which is a just transition, which means that those who do not yet have access to energy do have access to energy.
I would like to throw out one question here that anybody can feel free to answer. Latin America for a very long time the economies have been driven by producing basic resources that go into what we consume here in the United States, in Europe, and other countries that are much more wealthy than Latin America. So there's a great dependence on getting stuff out of the ground that we need here to build what we want to consume. So my question is, how can we have sustainability in Latin America without a change in that dynamic? In other words, can we have sustainability while we in the United States have this hunger for resources that goes far beyond what you require locally? Carlos?
Michael, yeah, I'd like to make a comment on Shannon's comment too, and of course your question. You know, Colombia had 70% of his energy matrix in hydro. And as Governor Verano was just saying, we are in trouble. There's no raining, we have no water, less than 30% of our hydroelectric energy factories are in trouble. But you know, there's a way to be sustainable, especially in those products that you talk about, the basic and all these kind of projects. You know, I had these numbers here. Lithium. Latin America has more than 70% of the lithium reserves in the world. Only Chile, 52%. Argentina, 17%. So we need lithium for energy transition. Then we have more than 55% of the copper reserves in the world. Chile has 28, Peru 13, Mexico 6%, United States 7%. So we need these transition materials to do the energy transition in the next years. And we have those materials. So now how are we going to do the mining in the next years? Is it going to be sustainable? Can we do a swap with some other countries that need those materials? So I think it's a reflection that we need to ask, you know, all of us in Latin America, because there's a huge opportunity, not only for sustainable actions, but also for finance and income for the people. But we should be responsible in the way of how we do this. Yeah.
Okay, I see the banker in the room has something to say. Very important.
I just want to say, I want to take it from the perspective of the supply chain. To the extent you're talking about companies in Latin America providing or supplying a good to the U.S., then I'm actually hopeful. And I'm hopeful because many U.S. corporations now have signed up for net zero commitments. And as part of that, they have to think about their scope 3, which is their supply chain. And to meet their net zero targets, they're going to have to work with companies in Latin America to develop sustainable strategies to make their supply chains as sustainable as possible. And so I'm an optimist when it comes to the greening of our supply chain. But that being said, I think a really critical thing for everyone in this room is to ensure that the companies that have made their net zero commitments stick to their net zero commitments.
And do banks play into that? So if you're not going to lend money unless you meet certain criteria?
So we assess the transition plans, the credible transition plans of each of our clients, from the moment of onboarding to the moment through the term of a loan to the renewal, to the point of renewal or not. And we do hold our companies to which we lend responsible to transition. And we take that very seriously because we as a bank have also made a net zero commitment. And our scope 3 is our lending. And so for us to meet our net zero commitment, we have to hold all of our corporations responsible as well.
Wow, okay. Got a lot of people want to talk here. Governor, I'll start with you.
Thank you. La meta es definitivamente la descarbonización.
The goal is the decarbonization of the economy. Obviously, we have to reach net zero emissions, and if we want to reach net zero, we have to have all the tasks done and a very clear program. In our case, there is a very important discussion of the topic at the highest level. In our department, for example, we have all the possibilities for developing solar energy. And there is a department nearby, the Guajira, that also has very good light level conditions, as well as weather quality, wind quality conditions. So we could develop net zero energies with a very organized energy transition for solar and wind. However, we do have large gas reserves, which, well, we had great expectations to have been able to use them to have, well, so to say, energy peace or safety in this transition process. So the discussion is if we could use gas or solar is a discussion that is very, very important for our territory. Why not require, for example, I was in Corelca, the corporation in charge of the electricity or power supply of our country. At that time, we saw an ever-increasing process of improvement of the energy plants. And the main characteristic was to have the lowest CO2 emissions. So why don't we require processes to go in every direction? Yeah, we have to decarbonize the economy and reach net zero emissions. That is the goal, and we know it. But we also should have the possibility to use, because we don't know how the evolution of these processes will be, if there are issues with the solar or wind, as we have had, evidently recently, for example. In our territory, we just installed more than 600 hectares of solar energy panels. And there were news somewhere in the Colombian territory about the fact that many of these solar energy panels were damaged by hail storm. So imagine, not everything has been invented, and we cannot depend on the single energy source, because that would leave us in the open, unprotected. So we have to start requiring and looking for, example, if we have good, significant amounts of gas in the specific case of our territory, we can use solar, wind, but also have a scientific requirement to the power plant manufacturers to have a process of improvement of the plants, so that we can use any source of energy, and they would be in charge for controlling the plants to become zero net emission.
I was just going back to your original question, Michael, about the resources that Latin America have, and when we're thinking about them, that we're not just thinking about it as a place that we go in the United States to get the resources that we need, without really thinking about what is a fair exchange, or what is a sustainable way of maximizing those resources. And I think it comes back to really, how are we creating the economic prosperity in the regions that have those resources? So it's not simply taking them and using them in the developed world, but how do we create the economic prosperity and the things that we take for granted as we're developing those resources? We obviously have to do them, and I think we've talked about that, in a sustainable, environmentally friendly way. That's a given, but I oftentimes think sometimes we forget about the economic prosperity that creates the stability, that creates the things that we take often in the developed world for granted.
Well, unfortunately, our time is running short. I know we have a poll, which I should have prompted a little while ago, but I'm not sure how to get it on the screen, but some of you have been answering. There we go. You can just look through that while I'm making my last comments. First of all, I must say, as a journalist, I'm normally pretty skeptical of things, especially about end-of-the-world issues like this. But it's very encouraging to hear that there are things that we can do at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, regardless of a particular country's capabilities, financially, et cetera. And it comes down to what we as individuals choose to do, how we choose to live our lives, how many, things we order from Amazon that come in boxes and boxes and boxes, for example, that it is possible to make a difference. I guess that's kind of the message here. And how the banking system, the private sector is really, really involved in this, and it is a priority. So I think that's pretty promising. And it'd be nice to see that everywhere in the world. But it's nice to hear that in Latin America there is hope, I guess. So thank everybody for coming. We have a great crowd here and all the panelists. And I enjoyed it.